Welcome to the MS&Me Radio Network. The broadcast shows are for informational and entertainment purposes only. They are not designed to provide listeners with specific personal, medical, or counseling advice. Individuals with a medical issue should always consult their healthcare provider. MS&Me is not responsible for content of individual shows. The views expressed by show hosts or their guests are their own. Enjoy the show.
I'm John Strum, and this is RealTalk MS. It's July 23rd, and we have a lot to talk about. Stem cell clinics and stem cell treatments are back in the news. The National MS Society has just announced funding for 10 new high-risk pilot research grants. There's an organization that's planning outdoor adventures for young adults who are living with MS, and I want to share an opportunity for you to participate in a really interesting clinical trial. And speaking of clinical trials, my guest today is Professor Jenny Freeman. Professor Freeman is a professor of physiotherapy and rehabilitation at the University of Plymouth in the United Kingdom. Professor Freeman's research has appeared in more than 150 journals and publications, and she's the co-author of Multiple Sclerosis Care, A Practical Manual, which is the reference book for all aspects of MS care. It's used by doctors, nurses, physical therapists, occupational therapists, social workers, and other care workers. We're going to be talking with Professor Freeman about the just published results of a clinical trial that I think will add a very effective component to physical rehabilitation for people living with progressive MS. But before we get to my conversation with Professor Jenny Freeman, there are a few other things that you should know about. We've spent a fair amount of time talking about shady stem cell clinics and their unapproved and unproven treatments that are being constantly promoted as cures for just about anything that you could think of, from arthritis to erectile dysfunction to Parkinson's disease and multiple sclerosis. And as I've said before, the only outcome you can be sure about with these treatments is that patients find themselves losing thousands of dollars that they've spent on a so-called treatment that never seems to deliver the promised results. So by now, some of you might be thinking that losing a lot of money and maybe not seeing the hoped-for result is as bad as it can get. In other words, this is the worst possible outcome for a procedure that in the back of your mind you're thinking, well, it's a procedure that maybe, just maybe, might work for me. But losing your money and failing to see a result isn't the worst possible outcome. So now, I want to tell you about a young man from Canada. When this man was 20 years old, he injured his spine during a trampoline accident, and after undergoing surgery and significant rehabilitation, he was left with partial paralysis in his arms and severe paralysis in his legs and torso. 6 years later, he heard about a stem cell clinic in Portugal, and this clinic promised that transplanting stem cells from inside his nose onto the spot of his spinal injury would alleviate his almost constant pain and maybe even allow him to walk again. So off he went to Portugal, where the stem cell treatment cost him $50,000, and that doesn't include all the additional travel expense. And unfortunately, the stem cell treatment failed, which isn't really any kind of a surprise. But after the stem cell treatment, he found that he was experiencing more pain than he had been experiencing before the treatment. So not only did he fail to regain the use of his arms and legs, but the level of pain he was living with had increased. But that's not the end of our story, because 8 years after his stem cell treatment, this man began losing what little function he had in his arms, and he was beginning to experience bladder-related problems. Well, after seeing these new symptoms get worse over 3 or 4 years, he eventually decided to visit one of his doctors at Memorial University of Newfoundland. Imaging uncovered a large mass on the upper part of the man's spine, Now, I imagine that some of you might reasonably be thinking that, look, sometimes people get tumors, and that large mass that appeared more than a decade after his treatment, well, may or may not have anything to do with that stem cell treatment. But then there's this. The medical team analyzed a sample, a biopsy, that was taken from the tumor, and they were able to exactly match the cells in the biopsy to the type of cells that had been transplanted into the man's spinal cord, the stem cells from the mucous membrane that lines the nasal cavity. Surgeons were able to remove part of the tumor from the man's spinal cord, but they couldn't get all of it without risking serious injury. So they're using radiation to at least slow the tumor's regrowth. And here's where things get murky and difficult for patients to process when they're considering unproven stem cell treatments. There are small studies that seem to indicate that, at least in animal models, using stem cells derived from the nasal cavity can work. And the clinic in Portugal that performed the procedure, well, they had even published a small pilot study that purported to show that the procedure was effective, but only about half the time in a group of 20 people with spinal cord injuries. But here's the thing. Their study wasn't randomized, it wasn't blinded, it only involved 20 patients. And it's really impossible to know whether the 10 patients that did show some improvement benefited from the stem cell treatment or from the rehabilitation that followed the treatment. The bottom line is that there's a lot scientists still need to understand about the efficacy of stem cell treatments and who might make the best candidate for these treatments. Stem cells may seem like the best potential treatment for chronic illnesses like MS, but the key word here is potential. And please understand that if this was a one-off example, I wouldn't even be talking about it. According to a 2018 analysis, there have been 35 known cases of complications or deaths following unproven stem cell treatments. The patients who didn't die from the procedures found themselves facing loss of vision, serious infection, cardiovascular complications, and cancer. And then there were the more fortunate ones, like Caroline Wyatt, a well-known BBC journalist. Caroline was 49 years old in 2017 when she raised $84,000 from her friends and family and traveled from the UK to Mexico to undergo an unproven stem cell treatment for her MS. And a month after the treatment, Caroline reported that she was feeling better than she had for a very long time. And if you like, you can pause the podcast here and Google the phrase placebo effect, because a few months later, Caroline acknowledged that she was feeling worse than she had been feeling before the treatment. So all Caroline lost was her $84,000 and perhaps her hope about the future. She's what I would call one of the lucky ones. So far, no cancer, no infection, no loss of vision, and no death. Meanwhile, much closer to home, a judge in San Diego has granted class action status to a lawsuit against StemGenics, a so-called stem cell clinic based in the upscale community of La Jolla, California. The lawsuit was originally filed on behalf of StemGenics customers who paid $14,900 for stem cell treatments for lupus, diabetes, multiple sclerosis, and other chronic conditions. In their lawsuit, the plaintiffs are claiming that they were enticed to paying StemGenics for these bogus stem cell treatments by a claim on the StemGenics website that patients experienced 100% satisfaction with the outcome of their stem cell treatment. Now that this lawsuit has been certified as a class action, hundreds of StemGenics customers who paid the same $14,900 for the same stem cell treatment, a treatment for which there is absolutely no evidence that it successfully treats anything, well, they can all join the lawsuit. The subject of the shady dealings of these shady stem cell clinics keeps coming up in the news, Because when you think about the huge amount of interest in stem cell treatments among people who are desperate to find a cure for their chronic condition, and you combine it with the enormous amount of money that these con men are taking in by taking advantage of that desperation, well, it's a volatile recipe for exactly the kinds of things that we keep seeing and hearing about. And I can only hope that because you're choosing to listen to a podcast like this one, that you're someone who believes in real science and not just in a random website that's been launched by a con artist spouting information about a fake clinical trial and inviting you to risk your life and maybe your life savings too for a treatment without any real scientific foundation. And while we're on the subject of real science, last week the National MS Society committed $540,000 to fund 10 high-risk pilot research grants. Now, these pilot research grants are specifically designed to quickly test novel concepts and ideas. Before an investigator can receive funding to pursue a new cutting-edge idea, they need to gather some preliminary data that will either lead to gaining that long-term funding for the project or putting the idea to rest. You can think of this stage in research as the proof of concept stage, and these pilot research grants allow investigators to do exactly that, to prove that a research concept has scientific validity and is worth pursuing on a larger, long-term scale. Now, some of the questions that these pilot research projects will try to answer include, can a simple sugar stop the immune attack in MS? Can cognitive fatigue be reduced using virtual reality? What are the factors that stop people with MS from better self-managing their disease? And does the body's response to the Epstein-Barr virus lead to the development of MS? Now, to give you an idea of how one of these pilot projects might evolve, previously, a research team at the University of Kansas was given a pilot research grant from the MS Society to explore whether a cognitive behavior intervention that involved sleep education, meditation, and cognitive therapy would reduce insomnia and fatigue among people living with MS when compared to a simple sleep education program. And while both approaches actually reduced insomnia and fatigue, the cognitive therapy had a much more powerful impact. The team presented the results of their pilot study at the 2019 meeting of the Consortium of MS Centers, and now they've been given funding from the National Institutes of Health to determine whether a web-based cognitive behavior intervention can reduce insomnia in people living with MS. And if you'd like to review a list of these 10 newly funded pilot research projects, you'll find a link in today's show notes. Toward the end of last year, I told you about First Descents, a nonprofit organization that provides free outdoor activities, community building, and skills development to young adults impacted by cancer, providing individualized care, medical attention, and the opportunity to connect with other young adult oncology patients. First Descents features week-long local and international adventures that offer activities like rock climbing, kayaking, and surfing. And we were talking about First Descents because they had launched a pilot expedition taking 14 young adults with MS on a week-long outdoor adventure in Montana, where they spent 7 days kayaking and, perhaps more importantly, connecting. Well, as a result of a highly successful pilot program, First Descents is expanding its adventure offerings for young adults living with MS. And this year, they're offering 3 different outdoor experiences. There are going to be 2 different whitewater rafting programs, one on the Rogue River and one on the Mackenzie River, both in Oregon. And they're also headed to Rocky Mountain National Park to do some rock climbing. If you're living with MS and you're between the ages of 18 and 39, or you know someone who is, these are remarkable experiences that are going to stay with you over a lifetime. And they're free. You can start the program application at the First Descents website, And you'll find a link to the online program application in today's show notes. The focus of the Clinical Neuroscience Lab of Dr. Ruchika Prakash at The Ohio State University is to investigate the effect of psychosocial interventions like exercise training and mindfulness meditation on cognitive and affective functioning in people with MS. Their goal is that by understanding the positive impact that these lifestyle changes can have, that's going to lead to improving the quality of life for people living with MS. The lab's current study is being funded by the National MS Society, and you have an opportunity to participate. It's a 6-month study, and in this study, participants are provided with either a Fitbit or a smart water bottle that tracks health behavior activity. Participants are encouraged to gradually increase their physical activity or their water consumption over the course of the program by using a mobile application that's been developed specifically for this study. The aim of the study is to assess how tracking a specific health behavior and increasing engagement helps improve cognitive abilities in people with MS. Now, participants in the study will be financially compensated, and you'll get to keep your monitoring device, either the Fitbit or the smart water bottle, after the study ends. If you'd like to find out more about the study, you can visit the lab's website, call the lab directly, or send an email, and I'll have all of that contact information in today's show notes. I was in London a couple of weeks ago attending a meeting of the International Progressive MS Alliance Scientific Steering Committee, and while I was there, I caught a news story that was being carried on the BBC about a 67-year-old man living with secondary progressive MS who is actually able to gain strength and improve his mobility so that he could walk his daughter down the aisle at her wedding. After seeing his mobility decline for more than a decade, John Kendrick was able to actually improve his physical condition. And that's something you don't get to say very often when you're talking about someone living with secondary progressive MS. But he was able to gain strength and mobility by using a standing frame as part of a clinical trial. That very successful clinical trial was led by my guest, Professor Jenny Freeman. And in a moment, we'll talk with Professor Freeman about how standing around can improve the lives of people living with progressive MS. Professor Jennifer Freeman is a professor of physiotherapy and rehabilitation at the University of Plymouth in the United Kingdom. Professor Freeman's research has appeared in more than 150 journals and publications, and Professor Freeman is a co-author of Multiple Sclerosis Care, a Practical Manual, which is a reference book for all aspects of MS care that's used by doctors, nurses, physical therapists, occupational therapists, social workers, and other care workers. I first became acquainted with Professor Freeman at an MS research conference where she presented research that demonstrated that standing without any additional activity could be beneficial for people living with progressive MS. And I thought that was a fascinating insight, and I wanted to know more. So here we are. Welcome to the podcast, Professor Freeman.
Thank you very much.
So when we talk about standing up in multiple sclerosis, we're not only describing a specific rehabilitation treatment, it's also the title of a research study that I'm hoping we can talk a little bit about. First, when we're talking about people living with significant physical impairment due to progressive MS, they tend to spend a lot of their day, understandably, sitting. What makes that dangerous, and why is it important to find effective interventions that can change that typical scenario?
Okay, so there's a number of reasons why it's a problem with sitting for prolonged periods. There's quite a lot of evidence, really, to show that being sedentary, and that means either sitting down in a prolonged length of time or lying down, means that you're more at risk of other conditions, comorbidities such as heart disease, etc. And that really relates to the fact that you're being less physically active, and therefore from a cardiovascular perspective, you're less fit. It also means that your muscles and your joints remain in the same position, and therefore the muscles can get shorter in length, the joints can get stiffer. And for people who are find it particularly difficult to change their positions, then for some people actually it places them more at risk of pressure areas because the skin and the muscle and the fat is actually compressed without getting a good circulation to it. In addition, actually, people find that they might become more constipated, or that because they're not moving about and they're not taking such deep breaths, that they might be more at risk of respiratory infections as well. So there's a whole range of issues that can be negatively impacted on by sitting for prolonged periods of time.
Can you tell me about what your study was about?
So the study looked at the fact that it's widely recommended that people with MS should be more physically active, but actually when you find it difficult to stand for any lengths of time, or that your balance is more precarious, it's actually very difficult to undertake physical activity, particularly since muscles often fatigue quite easily. And so therefore, even undertaking exercise programs that the physio might prescribe you in lying can be really difficult. And so in the UK, and I'm sure in other countries, actually on an ad hoc basis, physiotherapists can use standing frames. And these are frames which provide support at the knees and the hips and the ankles with a table in front, so that people are held in a supported but upright position, so that their legs don't begin to buckle and that they can actually work in terms of their trunk remaining upright. And those quite simple pieces of equipment can mean that people can stand for longer periods of time. Because the evidence isn't there or the evidence wasn't there, should I say, to demonstrate effectiveness, it can be hard for physiotherapists to be able to prescribe the equipment or for them to be purchased for their departments. And so what we set about doing was seeing if it could be demonstrated to be effective, so that we could make the case for these pieces of equipment being prescribed and used if it demonstrated to be beneficial.
One of the aspects of your study that I think is worth mentioning is that we aren't talking about a standing frame that you would have to visit a rehab facility to use. We're really talking about a standing frame that you would use at home. Is that right?
Yeah, that's exactly right. And that's the important thing, because at least in the UK, it's really hard or it's impossible really for people to get ongoing treatment. And more importantly, you want people to be able to exercise in their own homes and to really, with support and guidance, be able to manage their own condition. And so these frames, they cost about £550. They're made of wood, so they're aesthetically more pleasing, and they can be easily slid around on floors, etc. So that what we called in the study a standing assistant, but that's usually the spouse or someone that is able to help the person get up into the frame if they need it, is able to simply help the person get up in the frame, strap them in behind their hips or bottom and their ankles, and then allow the person to be in that safe, supported standing position for the length of time that they're able to tolerate or that they enjoy standing for.
When I actually first met you, you were presenting some results that indicated there were real benefits to just standing in a standing frame, yes?
It's the largest trial of physical rehabilitation in people purely for progressive MS. It's of 140 people, all with progressive MS, and all who, at their very best, can walk 20 metres with bilateral aids, so with a walking frame or crutches, for example. So they're all people who are significantly impaired, all in the progressive phase. And the study that we undertook was what's called a definitive trial, which means that the numbers in the trial mean that we can be confident that the results that have been shown are accurate.
I guess I'm thinking about people listening in the U.S. In order to go ahead and get some support from the private insurance companies for that standing frame. It's going to take a prescription and perhaps a convincing conversation with an insurance company to provide all or part of those funds. But it sounds like quite a worthwhile investment.
Yeah, absolutely. And don't think it's not just in the US where those kind of challenging conversations can be need to be had in terms of getting the funds for it, because we have a system in the UK where, because this is perceived as being a special piece of equipment, actually therapists have to write a case in order for the commissioners to purchase this equipment. And that's really one of the reasons why we undertook this study and are also providing helpful support and information for therapists, so that if we have evidence such as has been achieved by this trial, that they won't have to go through this quite bureaucratic process of a one-by-one individual application. Hopefully it will be approved as part of our NICE guidance.
Well, I am looking forward to including a link to the published study results to make it easy for our listeners to get the details and to point them out to the professionals that they're working with in their MS care to hopefully move this from concept to practice as quickly as possible.
That's fantastic to have that link. Thanks, John. And could I also say that within that article, people will be able to see a link to our website. And on that website, we have what we hope is going to be really helpful information in terms of implementing it within practice. There's information booklets about how to use the frame. There are videos at different levels of difficulty showing people how to use the frame and what they can do when they're standing in it. And there's also little videos of people with MS telling their story about the trials and tribulations of using the frame as well. So all those kind of bits of information that we hope will help people read through and decide whether the frame's something they're interested in or not.
That sounds absolutely wonderful. I mean, I think it checks off so many boxes. Well, first, it's new thinking, and anytime innovation can help speed along the process of rehabilitation and maintaining function and avoiding some of those secondary ailments that can develop if you are just sitting too long. I mean, that's a great step forward. The fact that it's being done in the home makes it so easy, as you pointed out. Sometimes simply getting to a rehabilitation appointment, or any real appointment for someone who's living with progressive MS, can have its own set of challenges, just logistical challenges. The fact that you don't have to go anywhere to get the benefit of this particular rehabilitation treatment is fantastic.
Absolutely. And the other thing that we found out from the stories of people with MS who were involved in the trial, they told us that actually it was also really a lovely experience for members of their family sometimes, because they'd be able to start playing with their grandchildren, but in a standing position, or their friends would come in and they would see and be surprised at how tall they were because they'd only seen them in the wheelchair.
Well, Professor Jennifer Freeman, thank you for your continued exploration and innovation in identifying ways for people who are living with MS to more fully live their very best lives. And thanks for taking the time to talk with me today.
Oh, it's been a real pleasure, John. Thank you.
Well, that's going to wrap up this episode of Real Talk MS. And that means that as of right now, we've wrapped up 99 episodes of the podcast. So I hope you'll join me next week for episode number 100. If you're a regular listener, you'll remember that we had a contest to find someone from among our listener community to interview for our 100th episode. And you're going to hear from someone who has an amazing story along with an amazing outlook on life. So please join me next week for Real Talk MS episode 100. And if you'd like to bring along a gift, well, the best gift you can give me is just taking a minute and heading over to Apple Podcasts. And I've made that super easy by creating a simple shortcut. You just have to go to realtalkms.com/Apple And once you're there, leave a rating and review for RealTalk MS. That is the gift that I'm hoping for. It won't cost you a dime, and it'll take less than 5 minutes of your time. So just visit realtalkms.com/Apple. That will actually get you to Apple Podcasts, where you can leave a rating and review for RealTalk MS. I'm John Strum. Thanks for listening, and we'll catch you next time.